Welcome everyone to the other CEO, Chief Equity Officers in Local Government. We are so excited to have you here today to talk about this really exciting new position that we have seen crop up across the country as a number of communities have called for more accountability for equity within government. It's my esteemed pleasure today to introduce our three panelists. First, we have Majestic Lane, who is the Chief Equity Officer from the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We also have with us today Michelle Melendez, Director of Office of Equity and Inclusion in the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Zan Gibbs, who is the Chief Equity Officer for the city of San Antonio, Texas. We are so excited to have the three of them with us today to talk about this really interesting phenomenon that we are seeing across the country, which is the development of racial equity offices. Those are departments and agencies that have been charged explicitly with focusing on equity and minimizing disparities within cities across the country. And I wanted to bring our three guests in today to highlight some of the really impactful and bold work that they have been doing in their respective communities. Too often, we think of government as not being responsive enough to communities of color. And these three individuals are great examples of governments that are being proactive in their work to ensure that every single one of their residents is being taken care of by the governments that are supposed to be serving them. So I will start here with a question around, I'll start with you, Michelle. If you could tell us about how your equity office started and kind of the impetus behind why your office exists and how it's structured.
Thank you, Ariana, and thank you to my colleagues. Muy buenos días a todos. My name is Michelle Melendez. I'm the city's inaugural Director of Equity and Inclusion, and I go by she, her pronouns. And I just wanted to say to this audience that long before I was a government worker, I was a newspaper reporter for 13 years, and then I transitioned into a career in public health, which involved a lot of community organizing, especially around immigrant access to healthcare and coalition building, really. And then I also wanted to acknowledge that I'm on Tewa land. Our state is very, very diverse. We've got 21 sovereign nations within our borders. And so just wanted to acknowledge that. But to answer your question, our office was established in 2018. A new mayor was elected. He ran on an equity platform. And I had known him for a couple of, maybe a decade from community organizing work. And so, you know, when he was using the word equity and using it correctly, I was like, okay, there's something to be done here. And so he restructured what used to be the Human Rights Office. And I'll tell you more about why that's important a little bit later. But he established this new Office of Equity and Inclusion as a cabinet level department. And although it was small, we started with 2 people. We've now grown to 10. And that includes an Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, Office of Native American Affairs, African American Affairs, and we've got a culture change leader, which is really a lot of the training that we do, a race equity data analyst, and a communications person, and then myself and a deputy and our administrative coordinator. So now we're not so small, but we definitely lead with race. You know, we're an intersectional office. We look at the intersections of class and gender and sexual orientation, and even touching on disability and rights of all people. But we're definitely centering race and race equity in all of our work.
Awesome, thank you. And one of the things that's really exciting to highlight is sort of how different communities have structured these offices. So even in places where, you know, we're seeing these offices crop up across the country, each one of them is unique in its own way. And so I'd love for you, Majestic, to tell us about how your office was created, how it's structured, and sort of the kinds of work that you all focus on in Pittsburgh.
So thank you, Ariana. And I want to say thank you for allowing myself to be a part of this. This is really interesting to talk about. I think we're on the cusp of something really new and unique in different cities across the country, and really thinking about it and thinking how can other folks do it in their cities and how do we have to adapt or adjust it, I think is really important. So for us, very similar when our current mayor, Mayor Peduto, has been in office for some time. And when he came in, he began a Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment. And that was important because prior to that, we didn't have a way that communities could really engage government. And the perception was that developers could get a red carpet, so to speak, but how could communities, right? And it was really a place-based, given the history and the tradition of Pittsburgh. But after being there for a couple of years, we realized, as I like to say, we don't just have a place problem, we have a race problem. And often place was standing in for race. So as things started to shift inside of the city, and we started to see for sure with data and research that the places were really undergirded by the fact that we had racial disparities that we were all used to talking about, but there was no actual solution coming from an institution. So in May of 2019, the mayor shifted our Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment into an Office of Equity, which I was asked to lead, along with being a deputy chief of staff. And if I really say anywhere we know that race or gender is a stand-in for quality of life, we need to work on those things. So it just was a very pronounced way to really deal with it, other than just to kind of brick and mortar conversation. We know that it's a systemic conversation. We know it's a structural conversation. We know it plays out in real ways. So that's how we came to be.
Thanks, Majestic. And I think that that's a really important point, to be able to point to the fact that we have all these proxies for race, that we have all these euphemisms for race and racial disparities. And that's what I think is so powerful about the creation of these sorts of offices, is because you're actually trying to tackle those issues explicitly. And we'll talk a lot more in this panel around the specific projects that you all are working on. Zan, I would love to hear from you how your work in San Antonio came to be, how your office was created, and how it's currently structured, and any ways that it might differ from the Albuquerque and Pittsburgh examples.
Great, thank you so much, Ariana. I'm really excited to be here and reconnecting to the video, but I think my audio is connected. And
Yep.
I'm the Chief Equity Officer for the City of San Antonio. And our office was formed originally in 2015 as a one-person diversity and inclusion office. The city had hired somebody to essentially manage the city's non-discrimination ordinance. And so that person was a standalone person, really kind of managing non-discrimination complaints. And this was really something that came out of some organizing with the LGBTQ plus community in San Antonio around adding sexual orientation and gender identity to the non-discrimination ordinance. After that, the community actually informed the director about GARE. So the Government Alliance on Race and Equity came to the attention of the diversity director. And in 2017, she advocated to convert the office to an Office of Equity. So we've been an Office of Equity since 2017 and have slowly grown from a staff of 1 to just in the last year, now we are a staff of 5. Wow. So we have 3 program managers, and essentially the way we break up the work there is that we distribute the different departments to the different equity managers, and they're able to work directly doing a lot of kind of internal work with the departments on operationalizing equity and organizing staff to do some internal work.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think I wanted to also highlight the 3 of you, given your different geographic placement, and to illustrate that, these sorts of offices can be totally operational, can be really pivotal in city and county governments in various parts of the country. Too often we think about racial equity work, being focused in sort of, quote unquote liberal bastions or something like that. And, that's not always the case. And in fact, we would argue at GARE, at the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, that we really need to be deliberate in every aspect of our work in every part of our country. And so I'd like to turn our attention a bit to the more recent issues that have come to light. So 2020 has been a year of challenges, to say the least. 2020 has brought with it a number of difficulties, problems, challenges, and obstacles that local governments across the country have never had to grapple with before. And we're going to talk about some of those. And Michelle, I'd like to focus a little bit on COVID-19, on the pandemic, given your public health background, and also because I know that Albuquerque in particular has focused on their pandemic response, and that your office has been really pivotal in that response. So I'd be curious about how your work shifted due to COVID-19, as well as, you know, how your office was utilized in being responsive to the moment in terms of the spread of cases, in terms of the public health landscape in Albuquerque in general.
Yeah. Well, COVID for us meant that we had to turn on a dime. I mean, just stop everything that we were doing and focus almost exclusively on containing the spread and mitigating the extreme harsh realities of economic and social fallout from this, because we knew that it was going to impact communities of color. They would have the hardest time surviving this epidemic and coming out of it and rebounding at all. And so people laugh at me because I volunteered to join our city's emergency operations center, which is like this really, Star Trek control tower kind of room with, 30 desks and 30 computers. And, we had to social distance, of course, but it's a very structured approach to emergency management. And my reason for jumping in there was to leverage as much as we could to address racism as a public health emergency that it is. I mean, in my public health days, this is what we always dreamed of: is what if we treated racism as a public health emergency? What if we treated poverty as a public health emergency? And so what we were trying to do is basically steer resources to where they needed to go to try to mitigate that huge impact that it was going to have, knowing that everybody was going to be impacted, but some people would be impacted more heavily. And so, 8 months in, I think we're still doing our best to direct those resources to the people who are having the hardest time surviving and recovering, and really applying a racial equity analysis to emergency funding, to using data to do quick gap analyses of where we're reaching people, where we're not, by looking at those that are most vulnerable. So kind of all of the work that communities and organizers and others have been doing to kind of identify the needs, just elevating those and knowing that that would really serve our city well in terms of reaching people who are in need of food and other kind of supplies, forecasting evictions and mapping where they're taking place almost in real time, and then trying to direct our resources to those places. And then using really data, data like nobody's business, to help our community do what it was doing. Because meanwhile, all of our community partners are doing mutual aid efforts and organizing themselves. And so an example I can think of is a Native Leadership Council with more than 30 organizations got to use data that we provided them that showed where Native Americans live in our city. And, there's these preconceptions that everybody thinks that they know where they're concentrated in a poorer part of town. But by looking at the data, we see that they're in all parts of town. And then we looked at where are we providing services now, through the health centers, through the food banks, through every single resource that we could, and then showed them this data, and they could say, hey, it looks like there's a big gap right here in this part of town. And so that's where they decided to focus their efforts. So it was all kind of mutual, using data to respond as effectively as we could. Another example I'll give is because we are so tied in with our immigrant and refugee communities from more than a decade of work, we know what to make of data. So for example, our Department of Health, it's a state Department of Health, had the COVID case rates. And we saw this what do you call it, a cluster, a little breakout. And they didn't know what to make of that from some computer in some office someplace else. But when we saw it, we're like, oh man, that's where a bunch of refugees all live in certain apartment complexes because that's where they're resettled. And they're not great apartment complexes. You know, we know them because they don't treat people very well all the time. And we're constantly trying to intervene and advocate for their interests. And so when we saw that, we helped our Department of Health change their approach. Because at first, you know, they're well-intentioned saying, okay, well, we'll start doing testing at the apartment complex. And it's like, no, you don't need to further stigmatize people. They're already very, you know, at risk. And instead, why don't we bring them to where healthcare and people that they trust, and you know, use our language services. The information has to go out in multiple languages. And so we really accelerated rapidly all of our outreach in multiple languages, and working with partners and even educating some of those partners who aren't used to really being in good communication, so that their interventions would be better because they were more close to what the community actually needed, and had that in mind that, you know, people are vulnerable and you don't want to expose them further and stigmatize them. So that was a big part of what our office did. And all of that is still going to serve us really well when we go back to what our game plan was, to really change and dismantle systems of oppression within our city government. So it's not like we were taken off task. It was just that we had to rapidly accelerate everything we were doing, use everything we know, all of our networks to go for this problem. And then we'll go back to working on kind of the mundane things that we find very exciting, like infrastructure and, you know, policies, and where we're going to be investing our capital improvement dollars, and, you know, that kind of thing.
Thank you. And I'm so glad that you talked about data and also community engagement, because one thing that I think having an Office of Equity really gives our community lawmakers the tools to be able to move quickly in a situation like COVID that was unprecedented, and or is really, it's still going on, that is unprecedented. And government often isn't equipped to act quickly. And so the fact that you had staff at your disposal, the fact that you had already been doing this work really is what enabled you to be even more effective in that moment. So thank you for sharing those great examples.
Thank you.
I'm going to turn to you, Zan. So I know that in San Antonio, with regard to COVID response, you all have essentially looked at your data and determined that there are three areas that you wanted to focus on as a city. And so I'd love for you to talk about some of the work that you're doing with regard to those areas.
Great. Thank you so much, Ariana. And Michelle, it was great to hear all of your different stories and connections with data, because the same thing was happening for us. We had the great fortune of having just finished San Antonio's first racial equity indicator report in December of 2019. So we actually had what we called kind of baseline data for the community, disaggregated by race across 25 indicators right before the pandemic hit. So what we knew was that San Antonio was already experiencing great disparities as it relates to health outcomes, housing stability, and economic prosperity. And then COVID hits, and those are three areas that are of primary concern as it relates to outcomes from COVID, right? So health disparities we're seeing just vast and deep as it relates to communities of color. Economic prosperity, right? Same issues because of job loss and just financial insecurity for communities of color, as well as housing instability. So we were able to sort of take that data, that baseline data that we had from 2019, and really tailor the work that we wanted to do as it relates to response as well as recovery, knowing that those three areas were going to need quite a bit of work and quite a bit of attention. Because our Office of Equity had already been established for a good strong year with 5 members, we had built enough relationships within the health department, our housing department, and our economic development department that we ended up just enhancing our efforts with those departments and really doing kind of deeper dives on how are they going to use equity data and equity matrix kind of analyses in quickly distributing relief funds. So we were able to help the sort of housing relief funds as well as the economic and small business relief funds be sort of looked at through an equity lens, and we applied an equity scoring matrix to the distribution process with those relief funds. And then moving into recovery, we recognized that this is going to have to be a long process to really make sure we don't want to get back to baseline, because baseline was highly inequitable, right? We already saw great disparities disaggregated by race, as well as 20% of our population in San Antonio living in poverty. We don't want to go back to 20% of the population living in poverty. So we're now doing what we're calling equity assessments in those 3 departments, so health, housing, and economic development, so that by the end of December this year, those 3 departments are going to have equity action plans for the next 2 years. So they're really going to be able to map out, okay, here's where we are, here's what the disparities we've seen in 2019 and now getting worse in 2020. What are we going to do for the next 2 years to really kind of operationalize some next steps and some actions by creating these equity action plans in those 3 departments. So that's how we kind of took the previous data that we had, looked at the new data coming out as it relates to disparities with COVID, and we're creating action plans so that they have sort of a roadmap for the next 2 years that we hope can help advance equity in those 3 primary areas.
That's awesome. Thank you. Those are, I think, economic prosperity, issues of housing, issues within disparities within public health. I mean, I think those are outcomes that we see disparities in across the country. And so it's really exciting to hear that you're focused on that, and your point around getting back to baseline. So much of the rhetoric that we've heard around COVID has been, oh, we just need to get back to normal. Well, for our communities, normal was pretty bad. Normal meant extreme disparities. And so as I turn to you, Majestic, I know that one of the projects that I was really excited to have you talk about is really coming out of this fact that since COVID, people can't pretend that racism doesn't exist. People can't say, oh, disparities aren't real, or, oh, that's overblown, because COVID has really brought those disparities that we all knew were already there. It's brought those disparities into stark relief, and I think has forced a lot of people who may have been resistors or detractors to those facts wake up to the fact that the baseline is not acceptable. And so I'd love for you to talk about your guaranteed income pilot and the population that you're focusing on, and sort of how you're hoping it will roll out to get at some of those long-standing disparities that have existed in Pittsburgh before COVID and were exacerbated by COVID.
And much in the way of my other 2 colleagues, really it started with data. And I think it's an interesting thing. Before, you would hear in government about being data driven, and we know the challenges that can have. And for me, it's about being data informed, right? We know that we centralize people's experience and that we try to understand what that means, but we should be informed by data, because there's sometimes in the aggregate, there are stories, there's trends that we need to know and we need to think about that we can't see. Maybe because we're not around that particular population or don't know what happens when they go inside. So you want to really balance that out. So with that, last year, the Gender Equity Commission that works within the Office of Equity commissioned a study to look at how Black people were doing in Pittsburgh, referencing to everyone else. So this was really interesting because it was one of the first intersectional forms of research. So it really compared Black men and Black women comparable to Black women and Black women in about 50 other areas. So, you always hear this population is doing bad according to this population, but you don't kind of get an idea of, well, how good is the population doing to other Black men or Black women or folks of a different orientation in different cities, to really get a feel of how are you comparison. In that, we found that basically some of the research revealed that when it came to certain elements, basically you could go anywhere else in America and have a better quality of life as a Black woman. And I think that was a shock to a lot of people, given all the other kind of situations. And it really rocked the idea of Pittsburgh being a place where everyone can make it if they just work hard. So that was really an important piece of data that we already knew, because we had been doing some equity indicators work for some time, coming out of the Rockefeller Foundation work. So we had an idea what was happening, but just drew it down a little bit. So one of the things that we did with that data was Mayor Perdue, as far as being part of the MGI, Mayor's Guaranteed Income cohort, actually identified that we wanted to do a guaranteed income pilot, because now we can see in America across the board that in times of deep economic dislocation, that you need a floor of income, right? And to your point, Ariana, there are populations who have been going through deep economic dislocations for multiple generations now, right? And so when it hit everyone, our government responded appropriately and said everyone needs an economic floor in order to keep up the economy. Well, what does that mean for populations who haven't gotten that before? So our guaranteed income pilot is somewhat unique in that we're actually focusing on Black women, 50% at AMI, area median income or less, to really look at what does the role of this income floor really do to help that population, right? What can folks do that they couldn't do before? What can they buy that they couldn't buy before? How can they build themselves to identify how they want to interact in systems and interact with jobs and employment in ways that they couldn't before? We're going to compare that to folks all across the city to really see how this is spent, to really look at our tax issues, some of our tax conversations, to really discuss like what's the future of this, acknowledging that federally we're going to be in this issue for some time. I think when you said that, like, hey, COVID's not over, by no means. And I think we're just seeing the stretch of what it means when our government doesn't respond from a federal level, and cities and counties have to respond. So we're really proud of the fact that we're focusing on Black women, and they're trying to really get the data and research to say, if we always say that this population is the most impacted, then what can we start to do? So alongside with the guaranteed income program, we've also identified and we've invested $1 million in a program to teach Black women entrepreneurs how to start businesses in many of our main streets, traditionally ones that were underinvested and were in Black neighborhoods. So between the GI program and this program, we're really trying to say, okay, how can we bring this together to actually do things that government can do to be a part of the process of minimizing the income, the income gap, because that income gap doesn't just impact Black women. That income gap impacts Black men. That income gap impacts Black children. That income gap impacts Black communities, and that income gap impacts the community as a whole. So when we start to see that this work is actually work to actually improve the entire region, the entire city, then the investment looks a little different. So we've been able to take the data and then use that data to inform investments that are hard to fight now, because the data is in on what we haven't done traditionally and what we have to do.
Thank you. No, that's so exciting. And I'm really excited to see how that program rolls out as it continues, and really excited to bring you back to share that with our GEAR network.
Sure.
I think it's so tremendous that you're focusing on Black women, given their, to your point, the fact that it's a lack of investment in entire neighborhoods. And I think using that intersectionality lens is so important to be able to actually tackle these problems at the root. So thank you for sharing about that. I want to turn a little more from COVID and some of the responses there into some of the other challenges that local governments have been faced with in 2020. So in the wake of George Floyd's murder, we have witnessed a national awakening for some, a reawakening for a lot of us around the fact that racism is alive and well, that racism and people's race determines what people's lots in life will be. And as the nation was really brought to the same moment, probably in part because we're all, or many of us were quarantined and we were all kind of being exposed to the same news, that collective consciousness brought a real response that we haven't seen before with regard to race and racism. We saw uprisings across the country. We saw many of our cities and our residents coming out and just voicing the despair of not being heard before, of continuously being ignored. And it feels like this could be a new moment. And I'd love to hear a little bit about how, I'm going to turn over to you, Michelle, how some of the uprisings around police violence in particular have affected Albuquerque, and would love for you to share about the work that you all have done in Albuquerque around responding to community calls for accountability in policing.
Sure. So first, I just have to thank all of the protesters everywhere, including in our own city, because that kind of energy and demands propels all of our work exponentially and like nothing. I mean, we could be exhausted, we can be tired, but this is the moment to push. And this is, I keep telling our leaders, this is about power. This is about power. That's the end. That's, period. And so the role that our office played, that was again, turning on a dime. It was like one day I was at the EOC, the next day I was back at the office, getting ready for what was to come. And our city saw major protests, and they're not as big as other cities, obviously, because our population isn't great, and very, very multicultural. So we're a city with 3% Black population, and we have an anti-Black problem in Albuquerque. We've been a city and a state with a majority minority status for a long time, but it's very much a colony. All of the outcomes on every single indicator are poor for Chicanos like myself, Mexicanos, people of color of all kinds. And but it was great to see all of the Native people and all of the Indigenous and Chicano, Mexicano community just supported Black Lives Matter, and let that be the absolute focal point for many, many months. And so my role specifically was really self-directed, where I was watching protests and sometimes going to protests myself and seeing the danger level really going up. So I started calling organizers in the middle of the night and saying, hey, what can we do? Do you want to try to talk to the police? Do you want to try to work something out so that we can defuse some of this? Because it just kept escalating. And it was a very hard position to be in, because these are people that I know and trust and love. And I have no illusions that they trust the police. But in that moment, what can we do to try to diffuse situations and bring the temperature down a little bit? And that's the role I'm going to be playing going forward. Now we're planning it. Last time it wasn't planned, but now we're planning for what we anticipate to be demonstrations right after the election, or election day, I should say. So it's just opening up those lines of communication in the interests of public safety. And then now there's been so much that's happened. I'm going to be helping with the selection of a new police chief. So our chief was let go. So you can imagine all the backstory behind that. And then, we've been visited by Attorney General Barr. He loves to come and drum stuff up in Albuquerque. We've been on that list along with Portland and Seattle and other places where Trump constantly makes threats, and he has actually sent law enforcement here. And our mayor stands up strong against this kind of behavior. And we're a sanctuary city, and we've always been a target of this administration who wants us to basically be bribed and to accept federal law enforcement and money with all kinds of strings attached, which basically amount to turning over immigrants, which we have held the line and we're not going to do, and we never will under this mayor's administration. We don't have Confederate monuments here, but we have Spanish conquistadors. So one of our statues came down, and a person was shot by a white supremacist, maybe militia person at the protest. And so luckily he survived, but it was a huge just disaster all around. It was unsafe. And so our department has helped our cultural services department, which is responsible for the public art, to have a series of really deep community conversations over the past 3 months about race, our history, and what it would take to have a reconciliation of any kind or any healing. And this is Indigenous and people who ascribe to a real Spanish identity, and which goes pre-US, by it's 400 years of history. So that is still ongoing. And we're going to be finishing that up later this month. And just in time for National Native American Heritage Month, we'll be making recommendations for whether this statue should come back. And it's been put away for now. And so stay tuned. Hopefully you don't read a headline that says that a conquistador was returned to its original place of being displayed. Now, the other really huge thing that came out of these few months has been our mayor made a bold decision to start a new department on equal footing with our police department and our fire. And so now, well, it's not launched yet, but when you call 911, you will have a third option. And that'll be basically a social work option. And it's for people who don't need police and don't need fire and rescue health assistance. It's all of the other things that are going on in our community so that we decriminalize behavioral health issues and addiction issues and basically poverty. And a lot of it has to do with just people being in desperate need. And so we've had a very, very intensive planning process, a very fast planning process. And so this is one of the challenges of working in government in a political cycle, because there's a pace to this, and doing what community has always known needed to be done and being able to plan something really well. So I was so proud that one of my top staff members, Mariela, she went on special assignment. So she stopped being the immigrant affairs coordinator and took on a special assignment because she's also a social worker by training and an MBA. And she took responsibility for planning the new Albuquerque Community Safety Department. And then she's been assisted by 2 others of our staff. So we kind of really embedded ourselves and embedded equity into the early planning for this new department. And then when it started going in one direction, because Mariela is so adept at engaging the community is what really rescued this department from going in another direction. And so now we can be very, very proud of the new department that is being planned and will hopefully be launched early next year. And then it'll be a work in progress. I don't know who has done this elsewhere. We hope to see other examples of having a third compassionate response when people call and they're having issues that need help, but not more law enforcement. So I'm really happy about that.
Thank you, Michelle. I mean, I think you really hit the nail on the head at the end there when you're talking about how, I'm not sure if this is going on anywhere else, right? I mean, that's one of the real challenges that that we're seeing as a network of local governments, as an organization that tries to advise local governments is, usually what we try to do is kind of we lift up what works. We try to find an example where something is working and say, copy them, replicate that. And with regard to policing, there isn't a lot that we can really point to. There isn't a jurisdiction that we can say, they've got it right, just do what they're doing. And I think that what is so important about the work that you all are doing in Albuquerque is that you all have really leaned into, how are we going to visualize something new? How are we going to come up with a different paradigm of what public safety is? And so I'm very excited to see how that rolls out. And I know that under your and your colleagues' leadership, that folks we have a really good shot of making this something that can be replicated elsewhere. So thank you. Majestic, I know that in Pittsburgh, kind of on those same lines, you all are also grappling with the fact that you have community members who know what the problems are with policing, who understand intimately the disparities involved in how contacts with the criminal legal system come to be, and that you are also trying to think through, kind of as a city department, what direction should you be going in, given these calls for accountability. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And thank you. And thank you, Michelle, for explaining kind of what's happening in Albuquerque. It is truly, I think, an example for the rest of the country, to, again, lead from knowing what's important, not just a political cadence of kind of convenience. So for us, the biggest thing for me, and I would say the biggest light or sense of progression that I've had thus far, was this idea that we've been talking about, our reimagining public safety, right? And it's something that caught on across the country right after the murder of George Floyd, and then other state sanctioned murders. And everyone's talking about reimagining public safety. And, I heard it from a councilman in Minneapolis, but I've really taken it on my own. City folks is what we do. We take good ideas and run with them. Is reimagining public safety starts in infrastructure. Reimagining public safety starts in economic opportunity. Reimagining public safety starts in all the other things that actually create the environment where law enforcement gets called, right? When you have neighborhoods where there's no investment, neighborhoods where unemployment is 30% and there's a underground economy, then it makes it easier to call law enforcement. There's things going on outside that they aren't safe with, they don't feel comfortable. So for us, it's what is the accountability to make sure that all neighborhoods have the same kind of public safety. That means you also have the access to the same levels of amenities. That means that we're investing in housing in similar ways. That means we're cleaning up the streets in similar ways. That means things that we don't allow in some neighborhoods, we do allow in others. And that's a process and a challenge, because after generations of assuming that this is okay in one neighborhood, but this could never be in another neighborhood. So what I found is that is the biggest issue around public safety. The things that happen with police come after all of the conditions that we've allowed to exist and that we minimize existing. So one of the things that we've done is created an initiative called Avenues of Hope, because we acknowledge that many of our main streets in the traditionally or largely Black neighborhoods have been ones that have not been invested in correctly. And again, even if there's been a tax credit deal or, a LIHTC deal, or, some money coming from the state with brown fields, there hasn't been the kind of broader investment that we know makes that place safe for everybody, right? And that makes that place a place of hope for everybody, and a place of feeling like that, they can exist in the city. So that's an initiative that I look at as about reimagining public safety, right? Our parks equity work is about reimagining public safety to make sure that we don't assume that white neighborhoods have good parks and that Black neighborhoods don't, or the neighborhoods that have a lot of newcomers into the communities don't have the same kind of parks because they don't have the same voice, quote unquote, downtown. So that's really been around this. Now, the other part of this conversation is, what are the things that, law enforcement doesn't have to be called? Well, for us, there are two kind of things. One, you have the kind of inner community violence, right, that you may see that are brought on by the factors I'm talking about. We have group violence interrupters that have been working in our neighborhoods that have reduced homicides over by 20-25% over the last 3 years, right? So we're seeing a steep and deep cut in homicides. And we know that's because people who are in the neighborhood are working along with public safety when appropriate to actually minimize crime before it starts, right? So there's one of the situations that you don't look at it and say, well, how much did they stop? Even though they did stop, we have a reduction of 25%. It's how much other stuff could have happened if we didn't do those kind of things. So we acknowledge that investing in our group violence interrupters is an important part of this work, to be able to do it. And number two, we have an Office of Community Health and Safety. We as a city don't have the control of the health department, but we know that on our streets are where you see folks dealing with opioids, is where you see folks dealing with being without addresses and homelessness, and these kind of things that emerge that, again, police are often called for, right? So police are called to deal with this, but they may have someone that might have some mental health challenges and emotional health challenges, and they're not equipped to do that, right? So we're really trying to partner with our health department, with our direct Department of Human Services in the county, to also say, how can we have folks that are going alongside and making sure they're taking some of the calls, that they know that this is not a call for law enforcement, that someone else can be dispatched, because we know that's an important component of making sure that doesn't run into it. Third thing I'll say about this is actually a racial issue around, one, drug use, and two, homelessness. What we found over time is that homelessness shows up differently in the Black community than it does in the white community. So homelessness in the Black community shows up with squatting. Homelessness shows up couch surfing, those kind of things. So what we've done is made sure that we brought that to the table, and this is a way, one of institutionalized equity, to say, hey, when you see homelessness in the Black community, it's going to look a little different. It's going to look like, quote unquote, a trap house. But in that sense, a trap house is really around homelessness as well as some drug addiction in the underground economy. So bringing these kind of things to bear so folks can understand what's happening is also part of how do we reduce the harm that can occur when police and community are interacting, right? And some of it is just the awareness that many in the police academy don't have, frankly, because we've asked the police department to take up for all the jobs that the rest of our civil society has often left people behind. And so they are not equipped to do those things. We know there needs to be partnership, but we know we need to do the other work to actually minimize the amount of times that they're interacting in communities that have not been invested.
Thank you, Majestic. Those are some excellent points around the fact that, when we think of police violence, we're often thinking of sort of the often deathly end result. And I think what both you and Michelle and your work in your respective cities is bringing up is that there are actually many potential interventions that can happen before we get to that police contact point, where city services can and should intervene. And that's about looking at disparities, that's about looking at lack of investment, root causes. And so I'm just so grateful that each of your cities have offices that are, dedicated to that, because that's really what we're trying to highlight, is that when you have people dedicated, full-time staff that are dedicated at looking at these issues and giving them the nuance and complexity that they deserve, we're going to have better outcomes for communities of color. And part of the reasons why we have those disparate outcomes to begin with is because enough attention has not been given to these communities. And so, Zan, I'd love to turn to you, because I understand that in San Antonio has also started to think through various instances where maybe police contact doesn't make sense. And I understand that there has been a move in terms of violence prevention to different departments. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
Great, thanks, Ariana. Yeah, it was great to hear Majestic, some of the shifts that are happening there. And, you know, we've definitely been having conversations here as well around sort of public safety being a public health issue, right? And especially when you look at it from a racial equity perspective. And what does public safety and what does community safety really look like? So we want to take a holistic view of what needs to shift around imagining safety. And one of the things that was sort of an easy initial shift was to take the violence prevention team from the police department and embed them in the health department. So instead of just having kind of domestic violence be the sort of quote unquote issue within public health, they changed it to be a much more holistic violence prevention team and division that now is nestled within the health department. So that's been a new shift, and it actually involved transitioning over a dozen positions from the police department to the health department so that they could really take kind of this public health approach to community safety. The health department already had an Office of Health Equity, so they actually already have a racial equity achieving community health program where they've got community health workers in communities of color really helping do sort of on the ground outreach, as well as sort of on the ground violence prevention staff that were staff of the health department. So now they're kind of merging all of that in to sort of reimagine what does community safety and violence prevention more holistically kind of look like within the health department, and get support from the already existing Office of Health Equity. So that's been really exciting to sort of see emerge and grow, and it's brand new, but they've already moved them over, and they're involved in conversations with us every couple of weeks about long-term recovery efforts as well. So what we've sort of pushed departments to also do is take the budget equity tool exercise much more seriously now that we're in this elevated time of racism, racial disparities, and also limited funds. So, you know, governments across the country have also lost a lot of fund and revenue generation during the pandemic. We had to sort of cut back to the tune of $50 million this budget cycle because of lost revenue from hotel occupancy tax. We also managed the convention center, so we lost all the money from all the conventions that were supposed to happen. So when we started to encourage departments to work on their budget equity tools early this spring, everyone said, no, I can't do the budget equity tool because I have less money. And I said, that's exactly when you need to use the budget equity tool much more strategically. Because as Majestic was saying, if we're not thinking critically about infrastructure and where we're putting our money that we do have for parks, for roads, for sidewalks, and if we just sort of reduce everything without getting strategic about where the money should go, we're going to, again, exacerbate disparities and not think holistically about what community safety really means. So we also enhanced this budget equity tool process this year with each of our departments and really encourage them to think, how can you allocate funds more strategically through a racial equity lens while at the same time reducing your overall funds? So we kind of flipped the switch a little bit. So budgeting for equity became more important even with less money. So some of the things that we were able to work with them on are things like sidewalk gaps, right? So previously they just were kind of looking at sidewalk gaps based on miles and which district had more gaps. And I said, okay, let's also add a racial equity matrix to that so that you're not just looking at pavement condition or miles missed, but let's also look at where are the higher concentrations of communities of color that have less access to transportation success and less access to public transportation. So adding that kind of equity lens to sidewalk planning is going to help them shift the funding. Even though they might have less funding, we're still kind of prioritizing projects using a racial equity lens. You know, same is true in the parks. Majestic was mentioning the parks example. We have a lot of problems here with urban heat islands, right? Because it's very hot. You've got folks who are waiting at bus stops with no trees lining the roadway and no bus coverings. So what can we do, even just thinking about tree planting or tree canopy, and how can we use the parks sort of distribution of trees and tree canopy methodologies, again, applying a racial equity matrix. So we tried to really push that this year as well and get folks to really drive their decisions using racial equity data. And luckily, we had already mapped out using our GIS tools, just the basic census data of where communities were, right? So they were able to sort of use these equity maps to kind of very quickly overlay some of their decision-making and where they could prioritize funding. So having those maps and having this equity data on the ready is really important for cities to have. So for example, when an emergency happens, when COVID happened and we immediately needed to do a response, we already had the maps that showed where the highest concentrations of communities of color were and where the highest concentrations of Black and African American families were. So they were able to prioritize their outreach, starting with the neighborhoods that specifically could have used the most rapid response as it relates to door knocking and resources and brochures and, you know, making sure that everybody had the information they needed about testing and masks and staying safe. We didn't have enough staff to do the whole city all at once, so we used the equity data and the equity maps to sort of start in the areas that we thought needed the most resources, and then we worked our way out that way. So that was another great example of when you've got this data, when you've got these things ready to go, you can think about them critically when you're allocating resources, even when you have less resources to allocate.
Totally. I'm so glad that you brought that up. You know, our governments at the local, you know, municipal, county, and state levels are all facing budget shortfalls. And, you know, historically, when there has been a scarcity of resources, usually that means that communities of color get the short end of the stick. And it's the fact that that your offices exist and that you all are able to, even when you're not invited to the table, sometimes you are, but even if you're not, you can kind of make yourself get to the table. And I know your advocacy and advocacy of peers like yourselves, you know, other chief equity officers across the country have been instrumental in ensuring that when those cuts are made, because they're inevitable, that to your point, Zan, you know, you're sort of, you have the information available that you can say, actually, this community doesn't need another cut. Let's cut over here, or let's cut over there. Or with regard to, you only have a finite amount of resources. And so this community, this neighborhood, this, you know, ethnic group, what have you, should actually get these resources first and foremost. So that's so important. Thank you for lifting that up. I would like to turn a little bit to sort of more of the individualized work that each of you are doing. You know, as I've mentioned a couple of times, these offices are showing up. We're seeing city councils and state legislatures starting to develop equity-focused task forces and equity councils and equity offices in their various levels of government. And depending on the issues that are happening locally, you know, sometimes those offices are created in reaction to something bad happening. Maybe there was a high profile hate crime. Maybe there was a police involved shooting. Sometimes they're more proactive, and, you know, you have an elected leader who is a racial equity champion, you know, as was the case, as Michelle mentioned earlier, you know, that's kind of how her office came to be. And Majestic, I think you too. You know, those are sometimes the ways that we find our communities getting positions such as yours. And I'd love to hear kind of some of the specific ways in which you all are utilizing your offices within the political context of your cities. So I'll go back to you, Zan. I know that, for example, in San Antonio, you have really focused on getting your internal departments to be thinking about equity. And you touched on this a little bit just now, but I'd love for you to elaborate some more. You have focused a lot on budgeting, I know. You've focused a lot on getting folks trained up to be thinking about equity and various facets of equity. So I'd love for you to tell us about some of the work that you've done and sort of how your office has gone about doing it, and maybe why you went about doing it that way.
Sure. That's a great question, Ariana. So when I got to San Antonio 2 years ago, I was immediately sort of excited by this conundrum of magnitude. So the city of San Antonio has 13,000 city employees. So that's a very large government. We have 40 departments. So when I arrived to help build out the office, I was the only equity person, have since then hired 4 other folks. So now we're a team of 5. But if you think about a team of 5 people trying to normalize equity with 13,000 employees, we knew that out of the gate, we had to design a way to spider web out to the sort of work around normalizing equity. So we did use the GARE model of normalize, organize, operationalize, and we tried to do right out of the gate some things in each of those buckets, right? So in the normalize bucket, we immediately launched an equity train the trainer program. So we knew we couldn't do all the trainings. Even just doing equity 101 trainings was going to eat us alive if we tried to do it ourselves. So we immediately trained 50 staff across multiple departments to do train the trainer. So now we've got these equity trainers kind of embedded in the departments, and then we support them in delivering equity trainings in their department. So that was one of the ways that we started to do the normalizing of the concepts around racial equity and equity 101 within departments. And then the other thing we did right away in what I call the organize bucket was we created a citywide equity committee. And this is an internal committee. So this has 1 to 2 representatives from every city department sit on this sort of equity kind of governing body, if you will. So they meet every month, and we designed a curriculum, a 2-year curriculum, really based on sort of results-based accountability, understanding and unpacking institutional racism, and also giving them the technical training that they would need to apply equity tools. So that group is really organized around the operationalize, if that makes sense, right? So they all kind of connect to each other. But the budget equity tool, for example, we train our citywide equity committee members on what the tool is and how to complete it. So then when it becomes the budget time of year, we already have these 50 individuals that are in every city department who can help their leadership really fill out and complete and think critically about the budget equity tool. So the citywide equity committee, you know, it's 100% internal. It's just staff. We haven't figured out how to branch out into an external community sort of task force or equity group. We've decided to spend our first 3 years as an office just starting to sort of build that scaffolding internally before we even kind of build out an external equity task force. So I know that there's some other cities that have done really phenomenal work around also having that inside-outside strategy with community and community-based organizations. And we're just starting those conversations in San Antonio. We just had a meeting about, for example, creating a health equity task force that would have community representation, because we know that COVID recovery is going to take years and we need to lead with race and racial justice. So we may actually leverage that to create an external committee, as well as coordinate it with our health department, since we do have the health department under the city and they have an office of health equity. So that could be a way that we could start to build out our inside-outside strategy. But we decided, because of the size of the city of San Antonio government and the fact that we really recognize there needed to be a lot of normalizing and even just explaining the difference between equality and equity, that really needed to happen in San Antonio. So we focused a lot on those sort of internal buckets and building out the scaffolding using this trainer model as well as the citywide equity committee model.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that being able to utilize kind of like what your strengths are and saying, okay, we've got all of these employees. How are we going to get them to a place to where we can really, dive deep and do some of that external work? Well, you got to do the internal work first. And so I think it's really important to um, understand the context within which you find yourselves and then sort of create a plan around that, right? You want to create something that's feasible. You want to create something that can be implemented and that will lead to other things. I think that often when we work with governments, people kind of want to like snap their fingers and have it be better, both from a community perspective as well as from internal perspective. Just can we just solve this problem? And it takes a lot of work. And so I think that the model that you all have in San Antonio is a really great one to emulate of sort of the scaffolding, as you said, how to get from point A to point B in order to get to point J. um, I'll turn to you now, Majestic, and I want to hear about the work that you all are doing. So Pittsburgh's really interesting because you all are part of a couple of these national cohorts where you're working. You mentioned the one around guaranteed income earlier, and the number of cities that you're working alongside with that. But you're also part of a cohort with Living Cities that is focused on really institutionalizing equity in sort of the small business sphere. And so I was hoping you could tell us about that work and elaborate on it for us.
First, I guess a little plug I like to get in, but I also have to say thank you so much to Gare for the training that you do. We were fortunate enough over the last couple of weeks for all of our kind of senior directors to receive training around really looking at racial equity through budgeting. Again, something that for us with the range of how much we'll have to cut are all numbers that I don't always like to talk about, but they're always real. But and it's more than ever to be thinking about when we may have to do. I don't buy more with less, but you can reposition and repivot with less. But what does that look like to lift up folks who traditionally always lose more in these times, right? When we kind of go through these situations, we always find that the folks who are Black or brown or different orientations, different classes, don't really get the access. So that's one of the things. And thank you for all the great work that you did helping us think through that. But another thing for us is institutionalizing equity in ways that we can't see. We were partnering with Living Cities around just basically economic opportunity, because there's often a conversation in cities. We understand the permanence of race as a fundamental issue in how America is constructed, right? But you'll find community members that will say, well, hey, if folks just had more money, they'd be okay. And while the research doesn't necessarily just bear that out, we know that that's an important element that a lot of people see equity from a very fundamental level through people of economic opportunity. So when partnering with Living Cities in our procurement, because again, a lot of these things happen in our procurement agencies, they happen in our management and budget agencies, and these are usually departments where folks aren't thinking about equity always in the same way. It's often usually for human relations, human rights, the Office of Equity, maybe the mayor's office, maybe HR, but often, kind of where the money is, folks don't tend to have that same vision. So we partnered on a buying plan. And one thing, the big things I learned about this is opacity is a subsidy, right? So when things are opaque, when things aren't aware to people, when a small business gets on and doesn't understand what your email is saying, or doesn't understand what your website is saying, or don't know when the next RFP is coming out, but bigger businesses and businesses that have someone just to sit and watch the website, right? They benefit from how opaque the process is. So the opacity is a subsidy. So we're trying to say, well, how can we actually get transparency to be something that models to put folks on the equal level? And those are one of the kind of secret and invisible elements of equity that are important. It also made our departments think about what they were going to do for the next year. So what it did is stop the ability for someone to say, oh, you know what I want to do today? I'll do this. And they don't do it from an equity level because they're just trying to get their job done. But if you're saying, here's what I'm going to spend for the next year, everybody sees it, everyone can talk about it, businesses can get together, they can create partnerships. It just creates a landscape that really helps. And that was one of the ways that we really saw when you operationalize equity. Those are one of the ways. And for some people, it doesn't seem to be that interesting, but we know the impact it has when folks now feel like they know every single deal that's coming down the pike. The same way a huge developer, the same way huge law firm, the same way all the things are right there. And that's just one of the things that we've learned in this process of the invisible forms of limitations and invisible forms of holding folks back, and how we have to open that up and use the institution and use policies, programs, and procedures to forward that.
Thank you, Majestic. I love that quote, opacity is a subsidy. It's so true. You know, these processes are really closed off to so many members of our communities. And that transparency is necessary in order to get to that next step, which is, you know, essentially putting more money in the hands of communities that have been closed off from the process. And so that's just a really great way of explaining how government can really play a role in opening up a process to, you know, entire sectors of our economy that have been closed off before. So thank you for sharing that. Turning to you, Michelle, I was hoping you could tell us about the really important and unique work that you all have been doing in Albuquerque around partnering with tribes in the area and doing work at the government level to emphasize tribal sovereignty and the various agreements that you have with neighboring tribes that are a really significant part of your residential population in Albuquerque.
Yes, most definitely. But first, I just want to say, I love listening to my colleagues so much because I get these great ideas, and maybe I'm just geeking out, but I'm like furiously writing down like, okay, talk to Zan about sidewalk equity, you know, talk to Majestic about opacity as a subsidy. So I had this little idea, maybe Gare and Race Forward can help. You should have maybe a CEO swap where especially Zan gets to come to my city and help us do some stuff where they have really, really excelled. And I don't know what I do well, but I will go anywhere and try to have a
I love it. You do lots of things well.
But you know, having the network is invaluable. And we did start a little differently because it was just like go, 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 go. We had a strong mayor form of government, and so we had the GARE roadmap and, you know, the structure, and it takes some planning and some intentional effort. And meanwhile, our executive leadership was just like, go, go, go. So the other thing that we had is we felt like we had an equity backlog in our city, right? Community has known forever what we need, and it's more and better jobs, and not just any jobs, not just service jobs, but jobs with dignity, jobs with justice, you know, policies for sick leave and things like that. We need community development and neighborhood investment, especially that doesn't gentrify our neighborhoods. So, you know, we focused in our first 2 years when we were developing our plan to really, really dig into things like who we hire as a city. Because while we do really well with Hispanic, we're way, way underrepresented with African American, Native American. So, you know, what's going on there? You know, city jobs are good jobs, and there's something going on there. And then who we do business with as a city. So, you know, to speak on some of what Majestic is saying, partnering with living cities to look at how do we restructure our procurement. You know, there's a lot of money to be made in government contracts. Who's getting all of those, and how do we break that open? It's the hidden rules, you know, like as an organizer and a community activist, and even in my direct service jobs before this, I didn't know half of what was out there available in city government. And so how to make all of that plain for people so that many, many more people can participate in that. And then, you know, how and where we invest. So everything that Zan was saying, And then of course, how do we provide services and make it more equitable? And so that's where, it's important to have our offices, but those offices don't focus exclusively on one population. The what we do is to impact all of those populations, right? And so the how we do it is through these offices, and it's because they have deep relationships and constant interactions with the community. And so, and then we do things like hiring interns in AmeriCorps and just constantly helping our city to learn how to do community engagement, because we were always on the opposite side trying to engage with the city. And now we're on the inside trying to make the city a more responsive and receptive engager, and to actually do something with this community knowledge that people have. We know better than anybody what we need in our communities. And so that's just a little background on what we're trying to do. And then to speak to one of your earlier questions, we try to use this time to really leverage our opportunities. So in this past couple of months, we've pushed through some really good, somewhat landmark legislation so that we embed equity, because we don't want to solely rely on having a mayor who embraces this. When he moves on, what happens to this work? And that's why I wanted to refer back to our original, when I mentioned that the human rights office that existed, that we came out of. When I first walked into the office and saw files from 1974 and through the 70s when this office was established, and the enabling legislation, I knew that it had been written by activists, probably Chicano movement, probably American Indian movement people, because the same values were written all over it. Now that ordinance needs updating, it misses things that, fast forward 40 years or more, but we truly are standing on the shoulders of giants who knew that it was systemic and that there's individual discrimination. But unlike some civil rights offices, it was never solely about individual discrimination. It was always about systemic stuff. So that's why it was a strong ordinance that just needs some updating. And some of the other legislation that we passed, not recently, but last year, was establishing a Commission on American Indian and Alaska Native Affairs. And we don't know if it's the only one that a municipality has, but what we do know is that instead of just being appointed by the mayor and confirmed by city council, some of these commission members are appointed by their tribes. And this honors tribal sovereignty. And so the tribes, and we're talking out of the 21, 5 of them are bordering the city of Albuquerque. So those 5 appoint people to this board, and then, following their lead, what do they see as important for their members? And there are more than 400 tribes represented in Albuquerque, so when we've done counts of people, it might be one person from a tribe far away from New Mexico, but that's how many people have been represented in Albuquerque. So one of my goals was to make Albuquerque one of the best places in the country for Native American people to live. And if we can do that, then all people of color will have a better place to live, because what we do for Native people will serve other populations well. And so we established our Office of Native American Affairs, and we're doing things like when the city is putting out an RFP to build more affordable housing, we're like including all of the Native development corporations. They weren't on the radar before. No one thought, hey, I wonder if those guys want to build some affordable housing. So now for the first time, we're engaging in conversations with the Navajo Nation about building housing, not just for Navajo tribal members, but for all tribal members in the city of Albuquerque. And our own housing and human services departments are like, oh, wow, we hadn't thought of that. And it's like, yeah, let's start partnering at a real government to government level and with private enterprise that wants to do right by its people and make a difference, for their own people. So, those are a few of the examples on why. And then the way we engage, it has to be very respectful, and it's government to government. So one of the things we're doing is constantly helping remind city departments that, sovereign nations, they have presidents or chair people, right? And so they want to always deal with the mayor. They don't want to deal with me. We have talks with their staff, but we can never dilute the status of a tribal nation. So we're constantly reminding people that the presidents deal with the mayor or the governor of the state. They don't deal with program people. And it's not a snob thing. It's not anything like that. It's to protect and honor tribal sovereignty, because at the end of the day, that's what we care about the most. And so I'm just really proud of that for Albuquerque, and we hope that it really translates into concrete changes and improvements in the lives of our people, so that the city of Albuquerque does become one of the best places in the country to live for Native American people and all people of color.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I wanted to be sure to highlight your work on this issue because most people don't realize that, or a lot of people don't realize that, cities are actually much more likely to house, large populations of indigenous folks. And, I did not realize that 400 tribes are represented in Albuquerque. That's incredible. And so thank you for lifting up that important work. And also the matter of respect that you mentioned around, parity, that it's government to government, because given the history of how we have our various governments have dealt with tribes has been to, not at all revere them as equals. And so it's really imperative that we do that. And so thank you for lifting that up. As we get close to time here, I wanted to give you all an opportunity to share a little bit about sort of how you're feeling about this new era and doing this work. People have referred to the context that we're in, sort of politically and in terms of how we're talking about race and racism as, the new Reconstruction. And I'm curious how you all are seeing, if you're seeing a difference within your governments as a result of this, reawakening that we're seeing, and how you're kind of seizing that opportunity. So I will open that up to whoever would like to start.
I think just given my research on Reconstruction, I think the Reconstruction might be might be a strong term, just because of how much happened. I think, far too many young people of all backgrounds don't research Reconstruction and the immediate time after, and the impact it had on all folks in America, right? I mean, if you lay that on top of what was happening with tribes and immigration, you just see a really interesting time. So I don't maybe know if I would speak to that, but I do think there are eyes open to have conversations around what I could, like I said, I call the invisible, in ways that people were not ready for before. I think people are made aware of kind of just the sensitivity that so many people in America have to their lives being taken by the state, or the realization that, they have lack of access to opportunity. Even though that we know the intelligence and the skill are evenly distributed, we know opportunity is not, right? So I mean, I'm positive. I think it'll be an interesting, I'm kind of watching for the pushback. I mean, again, because one thing about the Reconstruction was everyone was with it until there was a pushback from folks who were negatively impacted and were not used to receiving the same degree of privilege. So I think the level of coalition building, the level of true power building amongst communities is going to be really important during this time, because just as corporations can give you $1 million, they can take $1 million away. Just as cities sometimes can put something on the books, folks can go and water it down in legal. They can water it down in the perception and amend the legislation, right? So I think really one thing that has to connect is true community empowerment. And, that's all the voices. Sometimes we have some of the voices, but really all of the voices, so the people that can work together and then come together as coalitions. But I'm positive, I'm optimistic. in the first time for a long time around this work because of people seeing the importance of it and the impact it has for the country.
Thanks, Majestic. Zan, Michelle, would you like to chime in?
Yeah, I can follow that, really similarly to Majestic. And I feel like, as equity practitioners, we're all on this roller coaster of sort of inspiration and despair on a daily basis, right? And, I want to echo what Michelle said earlier, that we all owe a huge level of debt and gratitude to all the organizers and activists that have been showing up for over 100 days now. And the amount of pushing that they're doing has, I think, completely changed the narrative on the inside. So, we've seen nationally folks showing up at council meetings chanting Black Lives Matter in cities that have never had that happen before. So, we were able to turn from conversations where people didn't want to necessarily lead with race on our equity agenda to now our mayor himself is saying Black Lives Matter in council meetings. So the shift for us where, systemic racism is now a term used on national public radio has enabled us to come to the table and say, we can't not talk about it now because it's literally on CNN. So that has been phenomenal for us because we were in this sort of still trying to just get people around this like notion of talking about race and racism to now we can actually talk about Black Lives Matter and systemic racism within a matter of 6 months. So that shift really has enabled us to go from not much on the books to a racism as a public health crisis resolution that they empowered us to help write. So we were able to get concrete actions in there that now give us some teeth that we didn't have before. So, if I put my excited hat on, and I remember that we've come a long way in terms of just being able to have that level of conversation with our elected officials and our city manager, we didn't have that 6 months ago. So that's giving us latitude to really sort of grow the work in a different way than might not have been possible had this national movement hadn't really emerged. So we're super grateful for that, and we think it is giving us opportunities that we frankly didn't have before.
Thanks, Anne. Michelle, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so thank you. I really agree with my colleagues, and it is a roller coaster. And I feel hopeful. Sometimes I can be a real downer, but I'm hopeful, and I think I draw that inspiration from the community. Like, there's no going back, and that's what I truly believe is that there's a stake in the ground and we're not going backward. We can't. And I hope and I practice that we in our office continue to be accountable to our communities. And because it's not easy, we've made mistakes. I've made mistakes, and I've been called in by community members that I know and trust and respect, and more than once. But I know that they have my back, and that I am a tool to help achieve whatever we can at this institution, and there's multiple institutions that have to be impacted. And I realize we're recording this before the actual Facing Race conference, and who knows exactly what's going to happen. But where I get strength is that our community is not going to be defeated. And so whatever role we can play within government, and I really encourage the organizers and activists to engage. If you have an Office of Equity, engage with them, because it's an inside-outside strategy. And if they don't have one, they should. And they can have a whole community of colleagues that I benefit from greatly, and from Gare and your leadership and all of the resources you provide. So thank you for providing us with all of that and this opportunity to try to push CEOs as a thing.
Well, thank you all so much. That's a beautiful way to finish. I am so grateful that we could highlight your tremendous work today. Thank you again to Michelle Melendez from the city of Albuquerque, Majestic Lane from the city of Pittsburgh, and Zan Gibbs from the city of San Antonio. I'm going to put up some resources here for anybody that wants to learn more about the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And you can sign up for our e-newsletter and learn from colleagues such as these esteemed colleagues here today. Thank you all so very much for sharing your tremendous work. Really, really grateful. So thank you.